The gas station on Route 9 outside Millbrook was the kind of place you stopped at only when you had no choice. It was a Tuesday in late October, the sky already darkening at 5 in the afternoon, the wind cutting across the parking lot hard enough to rattle the pump handles. Elliot Crane had pulled in on fumes, literally. The low fuel light had been blinking for the last 6 miles, and he'd been doing the math in his head the way he always did now, ever since everything fell apart. 6 miles at maybe a quarter gallon, which meant he'd been running on air and stubbornness. He was good at both. He climbed out of the truck and stood there for a second, rolling his shoulder where it always stiffened in the cold. He was 41 years old and felt 60 some mornings. Not today, though. Today he felt like a man with something to prove, which was almost worse. He swiped his card at the pump, declined. He tried again. Same result. He checked his phone. The bank app showed the account had cleared, but there was a processing hold on a vendor payment from 2 days ago that had frozen available funds. Temporary, the app said. Temporary. Like that helped him right now, standing at a pump outside Millbrook with $4 in his wallet and a daughter at home waiting on him. He put in the $4. It would get him home. That was all he needed. That was when he heard it, a voice low and frustrated, coming from the next pump over. Come on, come on. He glanced over. A woman, maybe mid-30s, dark coat, hair pulled back but starting to come loose from a long day. She was standing at the pump with her phone out, tapping at it with the focused desperation of someone who already knew it wasn't going to work. The screen of the payment app kept cycling back to an error message. She tried a card, declined, tried another, same thing. Elliot looked away. He had his own problems. He watched the numbers on his own pump tick up slowly. $4 of regular, enough. Then he looked back at her, without meaning to. She wasn't panicking. That was the thing. She wasn't crying or making a scene. She was just standing there with that particular stillness of someone doing the math, the way Elliot knew how to do. Figuring out what the options were, how bad it actually was. Whether there was a way through. He knew that stillness. He'd lived in it for 2 years. He walked over. Hey, he said. She looked up, and up close he could see she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Having trouble? My payment app is. There's some kind of hold. She said it matter-of-factly, not like she was asking for sympathy. My cards are linked to the same account, and it's a whole thing. I just need to get to the highway. Elliot pulled out his wallet. He had a 10. He'd been holding it back, mentally earmarked for his daughter's school snack order that was due Thursday. He looked at it for a second. Then he put it on the pump. That should cover enough to get you where you're going, he said. The woman stared at him. Not with surprise exactly. More like she was recalibrating something. I can't take that, she said. You're not taking it. It's already on the pump. He shrugged. Pay it forward sometime. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. I'll get your information and pay you back. Don't worry about it. He put his wallet back in his pocket and turned toward his truck. Drive safe. He didn't wait for her to answer. He wasn't trying to be impressive. He was tired and cold, and he had to get back to his daughter. And standing there, explaining why he'd done it felt like more than he had energy for. He'd done it because she'd reminded him of himself. That was all. He didn't get her name. He didn't think about her again. Elliot Crane had been a contractor for 16 years, residential at first, then commercial builds, then, for the last 6 years, hospital infrastructure, medical facilities, the kind of work that required understanding not just construction but systems, HVAC, electrical grids, emergency power, sterile corridors, code compliance down to the millimeter. He was good at it. Not good the way you put on a resume. Good the way people called you instead of the other 6 guys. His company was small on purpose. 8 people, all of them people he trusted. They'd ridden out the lean years together when his wife, Lauren, was diagnosed, and then when she died. The work had been the thing that kept him upright, not because he loved it more than her, because she'd told him to keep going, and he was the kind of man who did what he was told by the people he loved, even after they were gone. His daughter, Brinley, was 9. She had Lauren's eyes and Elliot's stubbornness, and an absolutely unshakable faith that everything was going to be fine, which she seemed to have arrived at independently, and which Elliot found both heartbreaking and sustaining in equal measure. The bid for the Hartwell Regional Medical Center expansion had taken 6 months to put together. It wasn't just a bid, it was a portfolio. 3 years of comparable projects, structural analyses, cost modeling, materials sourcing, sustainability projections. His business partner, Kevin, had told him it was the most complete proposal they'd ever submitted. Elliot believed him. He'd done the work. The contract was worth $4.2 million. For a company their size, it was transformational. Not just financially, it was the kind of project that opened doors to the next level of work. The kind of project that meant Brinley's college fund stopped being theoretical. That meant he could stop doing the math at gas pumps. He submitted on a Friday. The review committee was scheduled to meet the following month. He let himself feel something close to hope, which he'd learned to do carefully, in small doses, like a medication you could overdose on. The Hartwell Regional Medical Center Expansion Committee met on a Wednesday morning in November. Elliot had been told he would present to the committee for 20 minutes, answer questions, and wait for their decision within 2 weeks. He wore the same jacket he'd worn to Lauren's memorial service because it was the only good jacket he owned, and because the morning he put it on, Brinley had told him he looked like a principal, which she meant as the highest possible compliment. The committee room was on the 4th floor of the administrative building, glass walls, a long table, 7 people seated along one side like a panel interview. Elliot had done enough of these to know who mattered and who was there to fill chairs. He scanned the room as he set up his materials. He didn't notice her at first. She was at the far end of the table, dark coat, reading something on a tablet, hair pulled back. She looked up when he started speaking, and something crossed her face. Just for a second, barely perceptible, and then it was gone, replaced by the professional attentiveness of someone doing a job. He didn't place her. He gave his presentation the way he always did, not performing, just talking. He knew the project. He knew the numbers. He knew what could go wrong and what he'd do about it, and he said so. He answered the questions directly, including the hard ones about timeline and subcontractor capacity, and when one committee member, a man named Voss, who had the energy of someone auditioning for the role of skeptic, pushed back on his materials sourcing, Elliot pulled up 3 comparable bids and walked him through the comparison line by line. He thought it went well. He drove home and picked up Brinley from her after-school program, and she asked, "Did you get it, Dad?" And he said, "I don't know yet, Bug." And she said, "You're going to get it," with the total certainty of a 9-year-old who has decided something, and he pressed his mouth together and said, "Thanks, Bug." He thought it went well. He got the call 3 weeks later. Not a letter, a call, which felt like a kindness until it wasn't. The contract had been awarded to Pinnacle Construction Group. Elliot sat in his truck in the parking lot of the school where he'd gone to pick up Brinley and just held the phone against his ear. For a moment after the call ended, listening to nothing. He had done everything right. He knew he had. He found out 2 days later, through Kevin, who had a contact in the county procurement office, what had happened. A man named Stuart Alden, who represented a development group that had a financial stake in Pinnacle, had reached out to 2 members of the selection committee before the review. He hadn't offered anything illegal, technically. He'd just made sure certain things were framed in certain ways. He'd made sure Elliot's firm was described, more than once, as a regional outfit without the capacity for a project of this scope. He'd made sure questions were planted about liability and bonding. He'd made sure the evaluation rubric weighted certain criteria in ways that happened to favor Pinnacle's model. Stuart Alden was the kind of man who operated in the space between what was wrong and what was illegal, and he'd been doing it for a long time. Elliot filed a formal objection through the procurement office. He documented everything Kevin had given him. He submitted it and waited, and the procurement office sent back a response that said the evaluation process had been conducted according to established guidelines and the award would stand. He sat at his kitchen table that night after Brinley was in bed and looked at the response letter for a long time. Then he folded it and put it away. He didn't tell Brinley. He told her the project had gone to another company and that they'd find another one. She said okay, and then she asked if she could still go to Emma's birthday party on Saturday, and he said yes. She said good, because Emma was getting a dog, and she wanted to meet it, and Elliot sat there looking at his daughter and feeling something clarify in his chest. He was going to find another project. He was going to be fine. But he was also going to be honest, because he was raising a daughter, and she was watching how he handled things, and he wasn't willing to teach her that you quietly accepted it when someone did something wrong. He started preparing a second, more formal challenge. It would take months. It might go nowhere. He was going to do it anyway. Her name was Renata Ashby, and she had been the chief operating officer of Hartwell Regional for 11 months. She had come to Millbrook from Boston, where she'd spent 8 years restructuring 2 separate hospital systems, one of which had been hemorrhaging money for a decade when she arrived, and was profitable within 3 years of her leaving. She was 38 years old. She was not sentimental about institutions, but she was deeply, almost fiercely committed to the idea that they should work correctly, because she had grown up watching what happened to people when they didn't. Her mother had worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford the follow-up care after her appendix surgery, and the infection that resulted had put her in the hospital for 3 weeks, and the bill from those 3 weeks had followed the family for years. Renata had been 12 when it happened. She had been paying attention ever since. She had moved to Millbrook alone. She had a sister in Portland she talked to on Sunday nights. She had a habit of staying at her desk until the building got quiet, not because she didn't have anywhere to go, but because she thought better in stillness. She had been on the expansion committee because the COO was on the expansion committee. It was not her area of deep expertise. She understood systems and operations, not construction timelines. But she read the materials carefully, the way she read everything, and she'd thought the crane proposal was unusually thorough. She'd flagged it in her notes: detailed risk modeling, strong comparable project record, realistic cost contingency, rather than an optimistic projection designed to win and then renegotiate. She'd thought it was the stronger proposal. The vote hadn't gone that way. She had 1 vote. She'd cast it. The others had not. She had moved on, because that was what you did when an institution made a decision through a legitimate process. And she had other work to do, and she hadn't had enough information to believe anything improper had occurred. Then, in December, a formal challenge landed on her desk from a contractor named Elliot Crane. She read it the same day. She read it again the next morning. Then she called the hospital's legal compliance officer and asked for a private conversation. The review took 6 weeks. Renata didn't conduct it herself. She couldn't. She was a named party to the original decision. But she commissioned it through an external procurement auditor, over the objection of 2 board members who felt it was unnecessary, and 1 who felt it was actively damaging. She heard all 3 of them out and then did it anyway, because the documentation Elliot had submitted raised specifics, substantiated concerns about communications that should not have occurred, and you could not look at specific, substantiated concerns and decide not to look. The auditor found what the documentation suggested it would find. Stuart Alden had not broken any laws, but he had made pre-decisional contact with 2 committee members in a way that was a clear violation of the procurement policy, and the committee members in question had not disclosed those contacts as required. And the combination of those 2 failures meant the evaluation process was compromised. The board voted to invalidate the award. Renata sat in the board meeting and listened to the vote and felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly. Something more like correctness, like something had been put back where it belonged. The question then was what came next. The board wanted to restart the procurement process from scratch, which was the safe, defensible choice. Renata argued for a different approach. Because the external review had concluded that the compromised contacts had specifically disadvantaged the crane proposal, and because the proposal itself had been independently evaluated as the strongest in the original field, the board had the authority to revisit the original evaluation under the corrected record. It was not the simpler path, it was the right one. She presented the argument for 40 minutes to a room that was not particularly interested in the distinction. Then she answered their questions, and then they voted, and it passed 4-3, which was not comfortable but was enough. Elliot got a call on a Tuesday in February. It was from the hospital's legal compliance office, and the person on the other end explained, in careful, neutral language, that the procurement process for the medical center expansion had been reviewed, that the original award had been invalidated, and that following a re-evaluation of the original proposals, Crane Construction had been identified as the successful bidder. Elliot was in his truck in the parking lot of a hardware store. He had driven there to pick up a box of screws for a small residential job. the kind of job that paid the bills while he waited for something bigger to come through. He sat very still. "Can you say that again?" he said. The person on the other end said it again. He sat in the truck for a long time after he hung up. Then he called Kevin, who said something that wasn't exactly a word, and then he drove to Brinley's school because it was 3:15 and she was getting out, and he wanted to be the one to pick her up today. She came out with her backpack and her coat half unzipped the way she always forgot to zip it, and she saw his face from across the parking lot and said, "Dad, did something happen?" "We got the project," he said. She didn't say, "I told you so," which she absolutely could have. She just hugged him, hard, in the cold air of the school parking lot, her coat still half open, and he held on to her and looked up at the white February sky. He asked through the compliance office for the name of the person who had initiated the review. They told him it had been requested by the COO, Renata Ashby. He didn't know the name. He looked her up, the way you did. LinkedIn, a couple of press profiles from her work in Boston. She'd been at Hartwell for less than a year. She'd seen the challenge, commissioned the audit, argued the case to the board. She hadn't done it because she knew him. She didn't know him. She'd done it because the documentation raised a legitimate concern, and she was the kind of person who looked at legitimate concerns. He thought about what it must have cost her, politically, within that institution, to push for an external audit over the objection of board members, to argue for a non-standard resolution. He'd seen it enough of institutional systems to know that the easier path would have been to let the original decision stand. She hadn't taken the easier path. He wrote her a letter, not an email, a letter, because it felt like the kind of thing that deserved paper. He thanked her. He told her, briefly, that the project mattered to him not just professionally but personally, that his daughter would be glad to know there were people who did what she'd done. He didn't overshare. He didn't want to make it about him. He just wanted her to know that it had mattered. He mailed it to the hospital's administrative office, addressed to her. He thought that was the end of it. Renata received a lot of correspondence. Most of it went through her assistant. She dealt with it in batches, usually on Friday afternoons, which was her least productive time anyway. The letter from Elliot Crane came on a Thursday in March. Her assistant had flagged it because it was handwritten, which almost nothing was anymore, and because it was from the contractor whose case she'd reviewed. She read it standing at her desk, still in her coat from the parking garage. She read it twice. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Gratitude, maybe, pro forma, the kind you acknowledged and moved on. What she got was something different. He'd written about his daughter, just briefly, just one sentence. "My daughter would be glad to know. There are people who do what you did," and something about that sentence sat with her in a way she hadn't expected. She thought about it that evening, driving home along Route 9. She stopped at the gas station outside Millbrook because she needed gas and she was nearly out. And she sat there at the pump for a moment before she got out, looking at the familiar slope of the building, the particular angle of the fluorescent lights. And then she remembered. October, a Tuesday. Her payment app had failed, both cards linked to the same frozen account, and she'd been calculating whether she could make it to the highway on empty when a man had walked over and put $10 on the pump and said pay it forward sometime, and gotten in his truck and left before she could even get his name. She sat at the pump in the March cold and felt the pieces settle into place with the slow, vertiginous clarity of something you almost can't believe. She went home and pulled up his company's website. There was a photo on the About page, him and his team, standing outside a completed project, all of them squinting slightly in the sun. It was him. She sat at her kitchen table for a very long time. She wasn't a person who believed in the universe sending messages. She was a systems thinker, a data person, someone who looked for structural explanations before she reached for anything else. But she sat there in her kitchen in Millbrook in March and tried to construct a structural explanation for this particular sequence of events, and she kept arriving at the same place. A man who had $10 and needed every cent of it had given it to a stranger at a gas pump without asking for anything back, and 3 months later that stranger had been the one person in a position to correct the wrong that had been done to him. She had not done it because of him. She hadn't known. She'd done it because it was right, but he had done it too, the $10. The pay it forward sometime, because it was right, without knowing, without calculating the return. She picked up her phone and called the hospital's legal compliance office the next morning and asked for Elliot Crane's contact information, explaining that she wanted to follow up personally on the resolution of his case. She got his phone number. She looked at it for 2 days before she called. He answered on the second ring, a little out of breath like he'd been outside. "This is Renata Ashby," she said. "From Hartwell Regional. I received your letter." A brief pause. "I appreciate you calling. I wanted to reach out personally." She had rehearsed this, which was unlike her, and now none of the rehearsed sentences were available. I want to ask you something, and it's going to sound strange." "Okay, October," she said. "Route 9 gas station, outside Millbrook, Tuesday evening around 5 o'clock. The silence on the other end lasted about 3 seconds. "That was you," he said. "That was me." She paused. "I never got your name. I didn't give it." "No." She looked out her window at the parking lot, the bare March trees along the far edge of it. "I've been thinking about that. The whole sequence. I want you to know. I reviewed your documentation because it raised legitimate concerns. I didn't know who you were. I would have done the same regardless." "I know," he said, and she could hear that he meant it, that he wasn't saying it to be polite. "But I've been sitting with it," she continued. "And I want to say, what you did that night, and what you did with the challenge filing, and the way you conducted yourself through all of it, it's consistent. I've been in this field for a long time, and I don't always get to see those things be consistent." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "My daughter thinks I was going to get it eventually." "The project." "She's right," Renata said. "The proposal was the strongest in the field. I said so at the time." "I know. I read the meeting notes." A pause. "She's 9. She has Lauren's." He stopped. "She's 9, and she's very certain about things." "She sounds like someone worth being certain about," Renata said. Another pause, different from the others. "Do you want to get coffee?" he said. "Not about the project. Just. I feel like I should actually know the name of the person who did what you did." Renata looked at her calendar, which was full from 7 in the morning until 6 at night, every day for the next 3 weeks. "Yes," she said. They met at a diner in Millbrook, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that came in a heavy ceramic mug and a slice of pie rotating slowly in a glass case by the register. Elliot got there first and took a booth by the window. Brinley was at a sleepover at her friend Emma's house, the one with the dog, and he'd told Kevin he'd be out of reach for a couple of hours, and Kevin had given him a look that he'd chosen to ignore. Renata came in at 7 on the dot, unwinding a scarf, looking slightly less put together than she had at the committee presentation, which was to say, she looked like an actual person. She slid into the booth across from him and picked up the laminated menu and said, "I've been driving past this place for 11 months and I've never come in." "The pie's good," he said. "Is it?" "The cherry one is." She ordered the cherry pie. He ordered coffee. And then they just talked. Not about the project, not about the procurement challenge, not about the gas station, though all of it was there underneath, like a foundation you were standing on without thinking about it. They talked about Millbrook, which she found quieter than Boston and which she was still deciding how she felt about. They talked about Brinley, who apparently had very strong opinions about which dog breeds were objectively the best. A position she defended with what Elliot described as courtroom energy. They talked about hospital systems and what it actually took to change them, and how most people underestimated the difficulty, which led to a conversation about institutional inertia that lasted 40 minutes, and that Renata realized, somewhere in the middle of it, she was genuinely enjoying. He was not performing anything. That was the thing that kept striking her. He was just there, in the booth, talking about things he thought and believed, and he was funny in a dry, offhand way that caught her off guard. He was the same person who had put $10 on a pump and gotten in his truck without making anything of it. She thought about the word integrity, which got used a lot in the spaces she moved through, mission statements, strategic frameworks, board presentations. She didn't usually experience it as a thing a person simply was. At 9 o'clock he looked at his watch and said he should probably head back. "Yes," she said, "me too." They stood in the parking lot and the air was cold and clear, the kind of March night that suggested spring was coming without fully committing. "Thank you for the call," he said, "and for everything else. You did the work," she said. "The documentation you put together was thorough. It made the review possible." "I had a lot to prove," he said simply. She nodded once. Then, I'll see you at the project kickoff. He smiled, the first full one she'd seen from him, and it changed his face entirely. I'll be there, he said. She drove home along Route 9, past the gas station, the fluorescent lights still on, the pumps empty in the quiet Tuesday night. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. She thought about what she'd said to the board in that room, making the case for the non-standard resolution. When one of the members had asked her why she was pushing so hard for a path that was going to cost her political capital she might need later, she'd said, because the right thing rarely announces itself as the convenient thing, and if we only do it when it's convenient, we're not actually doing it. She'd believed it then. She believed it now. She thought about Brinley, 9 years old, telling her father he was going to get it, with the certainty of someone who had simply decided. She thought about how that kind of certainty got built in a child, what they had to observe over and over to believe that the world worked in the direction of the right thing. She thought Elliot Crane probably knew exactly how it got built. She thought she was glad she'd made that call. The road was empty and the sky was full of stars, and Renata Ashby drove home through the Millbrook dark feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, but its quieter, more durable cousin. The feeling of being in the right place, at the right time, having done the right thing, with more of the story still left to go.